Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, and thank you for being here. And to those of you who are watching the live stream, thank you also. I'm going to tell you a story today that happened in 1951 when I was 7 years old. May 31st is when it began, and it was the last day of school that day. But you know, as I was preparing for this story, it occurred to me, here I am in 2022, telling you a story that happened in 1951. And what if somebody in 1951 had been telling me a story about something that happened 71 years prior? What year would they be telling me a story about? 1880. So I got to thinking about there's so many differences between my world in 1951 and today's world that I would just set the stage for that. One thing we have in common with 1951 now, though, is that it was a pandemic year in 1951. It was a polio pandemic, which we lived through and had to be very careful. Things were closed. We couldn't go anywhere. So we had the polio epidemic going on, but there were so many differences. For example, we were very much a pedestrian society. And I mean that, you know, not as dull people, but we walked a lot. Very few, not all families had cars. I grew up in Salisbury on South Jackson Street, and there were people that worked at the Spencer shops, for example, that lived on my block, several men. The Spencer shops were the maintenance facility for Southern Railway, and it's where they brought all their diesels and locomotives and things to be repaired. That location is now the Transportation Museum of North Carolina, if you've been there. But the men didn't have cars, so I could see them walk by our house with their little black lunch pails down to the next street corner and get on the bus, and the bus would take them to the Spencer shops for work. And a lot of people used the buses. My family business, in fact, was a taxi business, so we thrived because not a lot of people didn't have cars. Women would call taxis to go to the grocery store and help them get groceries home and things like that. But one thing, too, on Sunday, we could walk to school. I never did anything but walk to school because I had a school just 3 blocks away, walk to church. I could walk to the Rowan Public Library. We were only 8 blocks from town, so we did a lot of walking. And I could, on Sunday morning, people walked to church. We had about 4 churches within 3 blocks of where I lived. And the people would just walk to church. They'd get all dressed up and walk by our house. I would like to sit out there and look at the people walking by, but my mother would not let me sit and watch if we hadn't gone to church, because I'd be, everybody else is going to church, and I'm sitting on the front porch. So we were very much a pedestrian world and did a lot of walking. The other thing is that we had just gotten television in 1951. Daddy had bought it that year, but we weren't addicted to it yet. In fact, most of the time I turned it on, it was the RCA Indian test pattern. Does anybody remember that? And I can remember only a couple of shows, and we hadn't switched from our allegiance to the radio to the TV. In fact, we still listen to radio, especially for dramas and shows. We listen to Lux Radio Theater. We listen to The Shadow. We listen to Meet Corliss Archer, all those kinds of things. Beulah we listened to. And so we weren't yet completely drawn into a television world. We weren't addicted to it. The other thing is, I remember when Salisbury got rotary dial phones. 1957, it was a big thing. We got rotary dial. Now, what did we have before you had rotary dial? Now what did we have? We had no dial phones. We had operators. We would pick up the phone, wait for the operator. She'd say, "Number, please." My daddy's business number was 77. So easy. I'd say 77, and it could connect me to where Mom and Daddy worked. But so much, we just didn't talk on the phone. Locally, we did, but never long distance because that was really expensive. I remember I celebrated my 12th birthday in Washington with one of my father's sisters, my aunt, and my mother called me on my birthday person to person. I was so thrilled because, you didn't. The only time people really used person to person, like we had a lot of relatives in Washington and around, and when they would be leaving to go back, they said, we'll call when we get home, person to person, and ask for ourselves, and that way you'll know we got home safely. So it was all very expensive with the phones. And also, we didn't have air conditioning. I didn't know anybody who had air conditioning in 1951. We used window fans. Some people had whole house fans. The only place that had air conditioning were the movie theaters. In fact, I have a story about the only time my father ever went to the movie theater. It was to see Mr. Roberts. And the only reason he went was the power was out in our neighborhood, and he wanted some air conditioning, so he went to the movie theater. So we didn't have air conditioning. All those factors meant that we spent a lot of time outside. The porch, we all had front porches. Some people had big front porches with wraparound porches and things. Most people had furniture on their front porch. We had front porch swing, a couple of chairs. And people at night after work would gather, especially in the summer and good weather, would gather on their front porches. And I remember those evenings so well. It was kind of like our social network. All neighbors would come out. Some neighbors would walk up and down the street and visit other neighbors on their porches. Sometimes all the neighbors on our block, we were sort of block-oriented, would gather at one person's house, and it'd be like they were having a party. In the meantime, all of us kids were out riding our bicycle, doing things because we could play out and everything. In fact, we played a game that perhaps would be useful in Tryon. It's a bit like hide and go seek, but it was called Ain't No Bears Out Tonight. So I thought I ought to start playing that because we see them so frequently. So the story begins May 31st, 1951. It was the last day of school, my last day in the second grade. And that day, we had to go to school, but not to do any schoolwork or anything, because the books had already been closed on our performance. All we had to do was drop in at the school between 9 and noon, pick up our report cards, and see if we were getting promoted. If I was going to get promoted to the third grade. I had two best friends. Dolores lived 2 doors down, and I think she's watching the live stream. And Mary Ann lived directly across the street. We were all the same age. We were all in the same grade at school, and we graduated high school all at the same time. We were all still friends. So that morning, I was so excited, but I was very nervous. I didn't know if I was going to get promoted or not. Now, Dolores said, are you going to be promoted? What are you talking about? But my mother had been to a meeting with the teacher at some point in May, and that had never happened before. And when she came in, I went running up to her. I said, oh, Mama, am I getting promoted? Am I getting promoted? Well, she didn't smile. She didn't say anything to me. She walked straight back to the kitchen and left me wondering, oh, dear, I bet I'm not getting promoted, and she just doesn't want to tell me. So I was really nervous about going to school to see if I was going to be held back in the second grade or move forward with my friends. But we got there, and we got our report cards, and we both were being promoted, which was a big deal. And we loved our second grade teacher. She was young. She was just out of college, and she was so nice to us. And we were talking to her. We didn't want to leave. We were just hanging around, lingering. But as we got ready to leave, she said, here, I have some art supplies that she was going to get married that summer and not come back to Salisbury. She was going to another town. She said, here are some art supplies I'm going to have to throw away, but would y'all like them? If y'all take them, that would be great. So we took these art supplies home. I was carrying a bag of plaster of Paris because we did a plaster of Paris project that school year. And Dolores had a bag of mixed crayons, a lot of crayons, nubs of chalk, some paint that we'd use for finger painting, some paper. We were just so excited. Walking home that 3 blocks, we kind of planned our summer and all the things, the projects we would do. It was a summer for us of freedom and possibility, and it was just, I couldn't wait. So later that afternoon, I was on our front porch playing with my dolls. I had took my jump rope out there, a book, my weekly reader. I still like to have everything about me that I need. And I was out playing on the porch. And our ritual, generally, both of my parents worked in the home. By the way, another difference is that my mother was the only mother on the block that worked. There were a couple single women on the block that worked, but all the mothers stayed home then. One reason it was so safe, I mean, that's like putting pressure on women, but there wasn't a block in town I didn't know somebody on, and there was almost no place I couldn't, in the middle of any day, knock on the door and there'd be somebody home. But I had a babysitter. Her name was Leela Ritchie. Mama had asked me to call her Miss Leela, but I didn't, and she didn't mind. I called her Leela. It was so much easier. She lived 2 doors down from us, and she was like a mother to my mother, whose own mother had died at 10, so my mother was always wanting a mother. And she was like a grandmother to me. And she lived 2 doors down the street. Some of you have heard stories about Leela and her sister, because another difference between now and then is that we all had running water inside and bathrooms inside, but Leela's house did not have hot running water. So every week, she and her sister would come to our house to take a bath. You know, we didn't think anything about that. They were like family. They came the back path to our house and brought their towels and their washcloths and their soap and went to our bathroom and took their bath. But they were very, very much a part of our family. And so she was my babysitter that summer. And her ritual was to come out about 3:30 or so in the afternoon, bring her sweetened iced tea with her, sit on the porch swing, and wait for the Salisbury Evening Post. Now, the Salisbury Evening Post was our main source of news. Local television, we had one station we could get then. It was broadcast from Charlotte. They didn't give Salisbury news then. I'm sure they do now because Salisbury is like a bedroom community of Charlotte, but then they did not. The only news we got our news from the Salisbury Post, but we also got it from the radio. The radio had news at 6 a.m., noon, and 6 p.m., but it was just short headline news and just a sentence about weather. In the summer, it was always chance of late afternoon or early evening thunder showers. But at lunchtime at noon, they varied a little bit, and it was a listing of the obituaries of the people that had died since the day before. For some, that was the highlight of the day. In fact, it was the highlight of the day for my Uncle Bill, who rushed home every day to get there in time to cut on the radio and be sitting down eating when he heard the obituaries. And it listed people who had died, but gave some important information in addition to that. It told you what funeral home had the body so that people could do visitations. But main news, local news, and even national news at that time was the Salisbury Post. And a lot of things were going on. The Korean War was going on in 1951. We had a horrible drought. It was called the Carolina Scorch. Crops were dying in our area, and everybody was worried about it. They'd even tried to seed the clouds, but to no avail. We were still in the middle of a drought. But we got all of our news, essentially, from the Salisbury Post. And it usually came about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. So Leela would come out with her glass of iced tea and sit on the porch swing and wait for the newspaper. That's what our usual activity was. But today, the paper didn't come as usual. We waited, she waited, and she was fidgeting. She said, "Dottie Jean, I can't understand what's happened to that paper. It should be here by now. I bet those presses broke down." Finally, close to 5 o'clock, the paper boy whizzed by and tossed the paper up on the porch. And she grabbed it, and she opened it. And I have some facsimiles here. The Salisbury Evening Post. The library gave them to me, and Steve printed them up for me. And she opened the paper, and she looked at it, and I heard her say, "Oh, God." When she said, "Oh, God," I knew something bad had happened. She said, "Bill Barnes drowned in the quarry today." Well, I knew Bill Barnes, except I called him Billy. He was a rising high school senior in town, and everybody knew Billy, really. He was well known in Salisbury and probably most of North Carolina because he was a star pitcher for our high school baseball team and for Junior American Legion baseball, which was really big then. And they traveled all over the state to play baseball. Not only that, he was a good friend of Mary Ann's brother who lived across the street, who was about 8 or 9 years older than we were. So they were classmates. So I knew who he was. I saw him occasionally across the street. He would not know me, of course, but I knew who he was. And I was so confused by that. I said, "Well, what's a quarry?" And she paid me no attention. She went on and she said, he drowned at lunchtime today, and they can't find his body. It hasn't come up. They can't find it. And I said, well, I said, what, how? I said, what is a quarry? She said, oh, Dottie Jean, you know that little town next to us, Granite Quarry? Well, they have several granite mines there, and they do what they call open pit mining. They dig this big, big hole in the ground, scooping up all that granite and sending it out, and they do this for years. And finally, I said, she was talking, I said, well, how can you drown in a quarry like that? She said, oh, eventually they dig so deep that they hit that river of water that runs underneath it. You know, that water that people pull on for their wells? They hit that water, and the quarry starts filling up. And there's nothing really they can do about it. It fills up till it's completely full. Sometimes, and as is the case happened in this quarry, they didn't have time to get out all their equipment. So the paper says that quarry is full of things like dump trucks, a crane. There's a little house down there. I saw a picture of that little shed, I guess, that the workers used for something. There were even rail lines, little miniature rail lines that had small rail cars that would carry the granite from the bottom of the pit, which is where they called the bottom of the quarry, up to the top. Otherwise, men would have to be toting that granite up. And so it filled up with water. She said that quarry was abandoned in 1930 or so. And it's filled up with water. Look at it, she said. It looks beautiful. It's clear. It's serene. And it's a temptation. For years it's been a temptation to boys to go out there and go swimming. And Bill and some of his friends that went out there swimming today, and something happened, I don't know yet what, but Bill drowned. Well, that was a lot of information to take in, and I didn't really, I hadn't quite still understood a quarry and what it was and what it looked like. So that was the end of our conversation. She picked up her tea and paper and went into the kitchen. And the last thing she said as she went into the house, she said, his poor mother. Well, the next day, I woke up. It was first day of freedom for me. I had kind of forgotten about Bill Barnes. I mean, I got up, and Dolores came down. We played hopscotch with the chalk that we had, and we're having a good time. And about midday lunch, I went across the street with one of my dolls to visit Mary Ann. And she had I was so envious of her. She had a big playhouse in her backyard. It was as big as a room in my house. And we could go there and play, and, you know, people wouldn't bother us. When I got there, she said, did you hear about Bill Barnes? I said, yes. Leila read the paper to me yesterday. She said, well, you know, Jack was going to be out there and would have been out there when it happened, but he forgot his swimming trunks. So he came back home, got his swimming trunks, but he had missed his ride. So he and his friend Johnny rode Jack's electric bicycle out there, the Whizzer. You know, it goes fast as a whiz. And they rode that thing all the way to the quarry with Jack steering the handlebars and Johnny sitting on that bar. But by the time they got there, Billy was already, it had already happened. It just happened. And Billy's friend, Frank, that they knew, was sitting out there crying. And I said, oh, I felt so sad for Jack. She said, Jack is real upset, but Mama and Daddy are furious. And they told Jack if he ever went to that quarry again, they would wear him out. So that afternoon, I went back over about time for the paper to come and sat there with my dolls and all those things I brought out there. And Leila came out about time for the paper to come, and Paper Boy came by and threw it up on the porch. I said, well, have they found Billy yet? Have they found Billy? She said, no, Dottie Jean. She said, there are a bunch of volunteers out there, but they don't know what they're doing. They are got some metal boats. They're going across the quarry and trying to drag the quarry with grapple hooks that they found out there at the quarry. Well, I didn't know what a grapple hook was either, but she told me it was a big, big, heavy hook that had about 3 prongs to it that the men had used to pick up somehow the pieces of granite or something. She said, and furthermore, they're dynamiting. They're hoping that if Billy is stuck, the dynamite will blow him up. But, you know, they're just fools. They're just making it worse. But there's nobody in charge, nobody. They're just out there doing what they think they can do to help? So that was, I said, well, are they fishing for Billy? She said, that's exactly what they're doing, Dottie Jean. They're fishing for Billy with those hooks, hoping they can snag him and bring him up. Well, the next day was Saturday, and I didn't want to get up. I had dreamed about Billy that night, and in the dream, and it's a dream that I've had multiple times in my life, Billy was in the water, and I was submerged in the water, too, in the dream, because I could reach out and touch him if I'd wanted to. And he was kind of with his knees up and kind of bobbing in the water there, but submerged. And he was looking at me like he wanted to tell me something or wanted me to do something, but it scared me. And I woke up, and I went out. Finally went outside, waited. Saturday paper came early because, Sunday paper comes really early in the morning, so Saturday paper got there about noon. So we were out there waiting, noon. It was midday hot. Leela had her glass of iced tea, waiting on the paper to see if something had happened. Maybe they had found Billy that day. I told her about the dream. She said, oh, Dottie Jean, I don't want you to worry so much about this. She said, they will find him. I assure you, they will find him. Your mama and I are a little worried about you because we know this has upset you. So we were sitting there. It was so hot. Leela had her glass of tea waiting on the paper. And she said, I bet Billy got a cramp and in that water. That water is really cold. She said, it might be warm on the surface, but it's very cold. I said, well, how cold is it? She said, as cold as ice in this here glass of iced tea. That's how cold it is. And when your body hits that water that's that cold, your muscles freeze up, and you can't move. You can't do anything. Billy might have gotten a cramp and couldn't save himself. We still didn't know the details of exactly what had happened that day. So we were waiting on the paper, waiting for it to come. But she was talking about how massive that quarry was. I said, well, how big is that quarry? She said, well, they say it's at least 100 feet deep and 300 yards across is its widest part. I said, well, 100 feet doesn't sound so bad. She said, well, it is if it's really dark and cold and you don't know where you're going and you can't see. She said, do you remember the Christmas parade we went to this past year? We walked to town, me and you and your mama, and Santa landed on top of the Wallace Building. And the Wallace Building at one time was the tallest building in New York, just a footnote. And Santa was on the roof trying to get down to the float at street level. And you were craning your neck, looking up and complaining, wonder where Santa was and why it was taking so long. He started climbing the fire escape with a bag of toys. She said, well, the Wallace Building is exactly 100 feet tall. That's how deep that quarry would be. And I said, oh, I see, that is deep. And think about it if it's dark and cold and you can't see. The next day, the paper came and there had been no progress made on finding Billy. Salisbury, Rowan County, did not have any rescue squad at that time. They had a fire department with some equipment, but it couldn't go out and stay for a long time at the quarry. There were a lot of volunteers out there. Volunteers started coming, but they didn't know what to do, and there were no certified divers, and there was no diving equipment at all. So they did the best they could with, dragging the quarry, dynamiting, things like that. But there was still no sign of Billy. The next day was Sunday, and that was an early paper day. It came really early in the morning. We usually didn't read it until after we got back from church. And that was Leela's day off. So I looked in the paper to see and I couldn't find anything on Billy that day in the paper. And it really distressed me. I thought, why don't I find any news about Billy? So the next day was Monday, and it was the first day of Vacation Daily Bible School. We called it Vacation Daily Bible School then. And my grandfather came and took me to Bible school. And then when I came home at lunch, went out on the porch, and midday, Leela comes out. And our next door neighbor, who's about the same age as Leela, they had been good friends for decades, came over and sat and talked to her on the porch. And her name was Annie. She said, Leela, I don't have any good feelings that they're going to find Billy. We don't have anybody that knows how to dive. We don't have any diving equipment. She said, I don't know how we're going to do it. And that quarry is just a danger because you don't know what's down there. And she said, we have only one promising bit of news. Do you remember Robert R.J. Halleck? You know, his parents lived in China Grove. Leela said, oh, yes, I know them. I know R.J. She said, well, he enlisted in the Navy right at when Pearl Harbor happened. I don't know that he was young enough, but, you know, a lot of people lied about their age just to get into and he joined the Navy. And he became a Navy diver, a certified Navy diver. And he's been a Navy diver for 10 years. Well, you know, he just happens to be on leave this week, in town on leave. And he's gone out there to help the divers and try to help and organize that effort. In fact, at 2:30 in the morning, this morning, he and a friend drove all the way to the Portsmouth Naval Yard so they could borrow the proper equipment, you know, for divers they have to be able to go down in that. So he brought it. And so the paper came, and Leela opened it. She said, you're right, Annie, they've had no luck today, but R.J. did go down one time. But he came up and he said it was just too dangerous. He said he couldn't see anything. It was completely black down there. That dynamite had stirred up everything, so it was cloudy and murky and a mess. And he said he was really scared of getting his line caught or cut. I said, what do you mean, his line? And she said, well, Dottie Jean, you remember that Christmas present you got this past year that Santa Claus brought you? And it was, she said, you know the one with the deep sea diver? I said, yes. She said, well, you know deep sea divers can't hold their breath long enough to go out and search and do the things they have to do. So they have to have a source of oxygen. So look at that deep sea diver in your toy. And I did have this toy. It was an odd toy. It was a cylinder of some sort with a little top button that was like a soft touch button. And you could press the button and the diver would go down, and then you'd let the button up and the diver would come up. That has a name. They actually use it for science experiments called a Cartesian Diver. And so the principle, they've left a little bubble of air up there on the top, and that's what pushes the diver down and lets it back up. She said, that diver has on a full suit and a helmet. Go look at that. And she said, he gets his oxygen from a line that goes from his helmet to a barge that's up there on the surface. And they pump oxygen into his line. And he's scared that if his line gets caught on something, it'll cut his air off. If it gets cut on some of that trash down there, water would fill up in his helmet and he'd have to get to the surface. So he came up and said it was just simply too dangerous for him to go down into that quarry at this time. So after Annie left, Leela was still reading the paper. She said, you know, Dottie Jean, they said 25,000 cars came and went in the quarry this weekend. 25,000 cars. It said that some people come in the morning before work, they come at lunch, they come at night. Some people stay all night. The divers, the volunteers are staying there on the premises all night, 24 hours a day. She said there's been a lot of help from the community, though. The funeral homes came out and put up those canopies that they put over graves and things to keep the sun off of the volunteers. And the churches are bringing food for the volunteers. The Coca-Cola bottling company is sending out soft drinks. The Cheer Wine Company, soft drinks. The bakery in town is sending things. So everybody's helping out, but 25,000 cars, she said. Now, that's not all at one time, but in and out all day. She said, you know, Salisbury is less than 20,000 people. So I don't know. These cars are coming from Mooresville, Winston-Salem, Charlotte, some from South Carolina, some from Virginia, because some of them just want to gawk, but some of them have heard of Billy Barnes, and they want to be here to see him recovered. And she said, the biggest crowd I recall being in Salisbury like that was April of 1945. She said, you were not even 2 years old yet. And she said, President Roosevelt died in Warm Springs, Georgia, and they brought his body on the train up through Salisbury, and it stopped. It was going to stop at the Salisbury Depot for at least an hour while they walked the dog fowler, did a few things. Your daddy wanted you to experience history. So me and your daddy and mother went to the Salisbury Depot that night. It was late at night when it came. Your father found us a good place, and he held you up on his shoulders so that you could see Roosevelt's train coming through. And at one point, a soldier came out and did walk fowler mayor from town got on board the train and took in a big wreath from the city of Salisbury. She said, Dottie Jean, I know you weren't quite 2 years old, but do you remember that? I said, no, I don't remember that. She said, I bet you'll never forget Billy, will you? And I said, no, I'll never forget Billy. So the next day, I went back to Vacation Bible School and came home. And I walked into the house, and the whole house smelled like Sunday dinner. I went back in the kitchen, and Leela had cooked up fried chicken. She had made potato salad. She'd made her green beans and corn and biscuits and her famous lemon chess pie. She had 2 of them. She said, Dottie Jean, you can have a little bit of everything, but you can't touch the pies. She said, all this is for the volunteers out there. Your daddy's going to come and get it in a little bit and take it out there for them. And it's the least we can do to help those volunteers out there. So that was pretty much that day. That afternoon on the paper, we were looking at the paper. The only news she had of Billy that day, because they weren't diving. It was too dangerous. But she did say that R.J., Robert Heilig, went to visit Billy's parents, and he pledged to them that he would not leave the quarry until they had recovered Billy. And he said he was doing it because Billy was a Rowan County boy. And so the next day, I had sort of given up thinking I would get any news about Billy that day. But the next day, Leela asked me, she said, Dottie Jean, have you been dreaming about Billy still? I didn't want to answer because I knew Mama and Leela would hover over me if they knew I was dreaming about him. And just that time, the paper came. And she said, opened it up, she said, Dottie Jean, they have a plan. They have a plan on how they're going to rescue Billy. She said they are going to dynamite a hole in that lowest wall of the quarry. And they're going to pump water out of that quarry until it gets down low enough that divers can see and it's safe for them to go down there. I said, well, how long is that going to take? She said, I don't know, but they've already started. And she said they're going to dynamite the hole, but one man has volunteered his heavy equipment. He's come out there to dig a ditch that will carry the water away from the quarry out into the woods. I said, what's going to happen to that water? She said, well, eventually to go back in the ground, it'll probably come back into the quarry. But they're going to get some pumps to the quarry to pump out the water and get it out through that hole and send it out into the woods. And when it gets low enough, they're going to then, the divers will be able to dive and find him. And so I knew that, I said, how long will this take? She said, well, I don't know. There are millions of gallons of water in that quarry, so I'm not quite sure how long it'll take. It'll probably take some days before they do it, but they are determined that they're going to do it, and they will find Billy. So the next day, it was Friday. I didn't really ask at that point because I knew they weren't going to be diving. So she read me a little bit of a letter, an interview actually, that the paper had with Bill's best friend, Frank. They were best of friends. Billy was the baseball star. Frank was a football player. And they had met up at school that day, and they both wanted to stay in shape over the summer for their athletics. And so they got a couple friends. They were going to go out to the quarry and swim, and it was their plan to swim every day. You think about why they didn't go swimming somewhere else. Well, the only public pool in town was closed because of polio that summer. And the quarry was such an inviting, if you look at that picture of the link, that is the American Quarry where Billy looked. So it looks like a beautiful lake, actually. But said that he woke up that morning so excited. He was just like you and Dolores, Dottie Jean. He couldn't wait to get to school to get his report card and see Billy. They're both going to be rising seniors. They were both going to be athletic heroes. So he got to school, and he hooked up with Billy, and Billy said, hey, he was driving his car, we're going to go out to the quarry and swim. You want to go with us? He said, yes, but I'll have to go home and get my trunks. So they followed him and took him out, and he went with him out to the quarry. He said, the letter said that he jumped in immediately when he got there. it was just so invited, he wanted to get started. And he started swimming toward the east wall. And Billy jumped in too after him to swim. And Frank made it to the other side of the quarry. And it tired him. It was 300 yards, but he crawled out and got up on a ledge and was resting when he heard Billy splashing behind him. And he looked behind, and Billy had fallen quite a bit behind, and he could tell that Billy was in trouble. And finally, Billy called out for him to help him, for Frank to help him. So he went back and plunged back into the water and swam out to meet Billy. But Billy, by that time, was in a panic. He had swallowed a lot of water. He fought Frank off, and while Frank was trying to save him, Billy sank. And Frank said, "I never saw him again." And he said, "I've lost my best friend, and I don't know what I will do without him." And so that was, I thought about that day that I had gone to school, as excited as they were about getting my report card and being promoted with my best friend, and how differently my day ended from Billy's, and how glad I was my day was different. So the next day, nothing was said to me except Leela said, the water is falling fast, they say. They have about a dozen pumps out there. Everybody has donated pumps. The highway department, the mills, Duke Power have brought pumps. And people are bringing gasoline out there. Volunteers are bringing cans of gas because the generators for the pumps worked off of gasoline. And they were trying to keep it going, and they said they felt they needed 15 pumps to really get to the maximum amount of water out of the quarry. The next day was Sunday again, and I looked at the paper. There was no news about Billy on the front page, and I didn't bother to flip through the pages. It had slipped off of the front page. But later that night, Mama said, Dottie Jean, they said today in the paper that the pumps were making a great deal of progress, and that every 24 hours, those pumps were pumping out 12 million gallons of water. 12 million gallons of water. I said, well, how many gallons do you think are in that quarry? Well, there have to be at least 50 million gallons of water in that quarry. But she said, there is reason for you to hope. So I was more hopeful that night, but I was still frustrated. I was frustrated that nobody was diving. So I got my dolls gathered around me, and I went and got that toy, that diver toy that I'd gotten for Christmas. And my dolls were awfully mad at me because I hadn't been paying them any attention. They said, "You haven't been playing with us. Who is this Billy boy? Who is he? Why aren't you playing with us?" So I told them the story of Billy, and I said, well, we're going to dive today to see if we can help. And you're going to pray, and I'm going to dive for Billy. So I took the toy, and I said, now you pray. And I pressed on that top button. That diver went all the way down to the bottom, and it came up, but no Billy. Pushed on the button, it went all the way down, and it came up, but no Billy. And I did that. But at the end of the day, Billy had not come up. So the next day was Monday. It had been 12 days since Billy had drowned, 12 days. And the entire effort was a volunteer effort. And there was RJ, who was the main diver, who had been a Navy diver for 10 years, who was really kind of managing that effort out there now, with the sheriff who was trying to keep the crowds in order. So that day when the paper came up, threw it on the porch, Leela grabbed it, opened it up, and read a little bit about it. And she said, Dottie Jean, your report card said you have great reading skills, and I know you went with your aunt today to get a library card, and you checked out a book. Why don't you come up here on the swing with me and read this paper today? And I said, okay, I will. So I climbed up on the swing. And she opened the Salisbury Post paper, and it said, "Body of Bill Barnes recovered from quarry." And we read it together, and it gives me chills even right now to read it. She said, RJ found him. Well, that thrilled me. I mean, RJ, he should be the one to find him. It said that they and the people there had talked, and they thought they could pinpoint pretty much where Bill had gone down. So after lunch, and the quarry water had receded quite a bit. RJ went down at 1:35. He went down. And he said he went down, and the first thing that happened, he stepped on a log. He thought it was a log, but he said, maybe I better check, because it was covered with all the kinds of debris. You know, they've been dynamiting and everything. He said, I swept the debris off of that log, and I saw it was a leg. And I swept the rest of the debris off of it, and it was Billy. He was lying on his back. He hadn't gotten caught up on anything. And he said, I notified the barge up ahead that they had a walkie-talkie or something, that I had the body. And he said, I didn't have to carry Billy up. All I had to do was just slightly nudge him. And Billy floated to the top as light as a feather. And he said he was no troublesome burden at all. By 1:42, they had Billy on the barge and were carrying him across the quarry to a waiting hearse. By the way, the hearse had been there 24 hours a day, every single day, since the day he drowned. And they put him on the hearse, and they had him out of the quarry by 2 o'clock, out of the quarry to the funeral home. And Billy was buried the next day. I read a little bit about it. So much of it I did not know when I was 7 years old. Many of the things I know they did not tell me. Some of the more disturbing things they did not tell me. But when I decided I wanted to tell this story, because I didn't forget Billy, and we did get on with our summer after they found his body and after he was buried. We got on with things. Things got back to normal. I got back to normal. It's nothing I dwelled on, really. But occasionally, Billy would pop into my mind, or occasionally I would have that recurring dream about Billy. So a couple of years ago, I decided I really wanted to tell this story. But there was so much I didn't know from a 7-year-old perspective. So I got the Rowan County Library to get me all the Salisbury posts where Billy had been mentioned. And I started researching. And then I realized what an amazing project that engineering project was. For them to be able to get 40-some million gallons of water out of the quarry, all with a volunteer effort. Nobody was paid. There was no rescue squad. They devised a method to blow a hole in the quarry wall, and all businesses, they had, at one time I know they had a dozen pumps. I don't know if they said they thought they needed 15, but I think they got by with a dozen pumps pumping water out of that. People came out. There were some gawkers, by the way, that came out who wanted, were interested in the show of the thing. But most people wanted to help. People brought food. They brought money. They offered their services. They tried to do everything that they could. They brought the gasoline for the generators. One woman started collecting money. She said, we have to have a Rowan County Rescue Squad. So she started collecting money and got enough money to start the funding of the Rowan County Rescue Squad. And last year it celebrated its 70th anniversary. It had its birth with the beginning of with Bill Barnes. And I looked at their website. Now they're certified in many different kinds of recovery. Even our rescue squad here, people on waterfalls get caught, they burning cars, drowning. So they're a very active rescue squad in Salisbury. And it's all started that day with Billy. So I have wondered, and I have not told, this is the first time I've told it to an audience like this, but I did tell it in a workshop that my storytelling coach did. And at one point I said, I don't understand what it is about this story. I said, I see Billy, I feel like he's wanting something from me, but I don't know what it is he wants from me. And she said, he wants you to tell his story. So I came here today because he wanted me to tell you his story. Thank you. Do you have any questions or anything? Okay. Well, I had, I had been rather disappointed in that toy when Santa brought it to me because I didn't know what in the heck I was going to do with that thing. It felt, and I ordered a Cartesian Diver a couple years ago, but now it comes in a big flask, Erlenmeyer flask or something with a top you can put over it and leave a little air. I started to bring it and do the experiment. It felt good because I was doing something. It felt good. I felt like it was an incantation of a sort or praying in a way for Billy, and it was the only thing I could do at that point. Anybody else a question? Oh, thank you. Thank you. Okay. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Dottie Jean? Uh-huh. I don't have a question, but I do want to make a comment about the extraordinary sense of community that you knew as a child. I'm very impressed at the neighbors and their kindliness, and also that your parents and other adults told you what was going on. I think today even I find among young people that they don't understand, for example, what we're suffering through the pandemic, and they are afraid, and that, you know, we really need to let children know exactly what's going on. Yeah. So I'm very, very impressed with the, you know, the love and the caring with which you were surrounded as a child.
Thank you. And in fact, one version of the story, I talk a little bit more about the community because, you know, there was something. At first, in fact, I asked Mary Alice, my friend that's here, what does this story mean? She said it was the beginning of. Oh yeah, sorry. It was the beginning of your engagement with the world. And I think that's true, because until that moment, I had been bound by Jackson Street and the school and the church, and I didn't even know we had quarries, didn't know about any of that. But it was the beginning of realizing there were a lot of people. There was a community. I had thought we had a strong community in the neighborhood because everybody that lived there had lived there a long, long time. My best friend, Mary Ann, was living in the house that her mother was born in. So people lived there. They lived there a long time. They knew each other. They helped each other out. So we had that strong community. Church also, I've talked about that before. Church was a big social life for us. But then I realized it was bigger than I possibly knew, and the world was bigger than I knew. And so thank you. Anyone else got a comment or? Okay.
You brought Billy so close.
Well, thank you.
To
thank
me.
you.
And I wondered about his parents, and if you had any contact, or your parents had any contact with them.
Thank you for that question.
And how did they grieve? How did they cope? What was it like for them? Do you have any idea?
I don't, but I can tell you a couple of things, and I should have mentioned them. Thank you for asking that question. I have made contact with two people who were Billy's peers and were out there that day at the quarry with Billy. One of them was Jack Brady, the boy that lived across the street, and I talked to him about his experience of that and the whole thing. The other, I hooked up through Facebook. There's a Facebook page called You Might Be from Salisbury If. And there was, one day I put something out there a few years ago. Does anybody remember Billy Barnes? And this man answered, Mark Hoffman, and he said, yes, my daddy was there. And he was a good friend of Bill's. We called him Billy. The paper called him Bill, just like people called me Dottie Jean. It was really Dorothy. But he was out there that day. And he said something interesting to me. He said, you know, when we got there, the quarry was pretty much deserted. There was one family from Greenville, South Carolina, but they weren't swimming or doing anything. But it was just us boys. So when the police got out there, they questioned us because they suspected foul play. But then the other people that were there corroborated what the story had been. But, you know, that was part of it. And he said, this was very sad to me. He said, I had to drive Bill's car home that day. It was a 1947 Studebaker, and he had to drive it home. And I do know that most people in town knew each other, so I knew my babysitter knew them. I knew that People across the street knew them. Daddy was in business. He knew a lot of people in town and knew them. So we just knew kind of a lot of people, or they did. I didn't know his parents. I knew who he was because of the friend across the street. But the interview with Frank, the friend who was swimming with him, was just extremely poignant. I tried to find him, but he died a few years ago. And Billy does have a sister who's still living in Salisbury. I haven't talked to her about that yet, but I think I will. It is. The quarry's still there. In fact, that picture that is on the link is the American quarry. There was another quarry in Granite Quarry called Balfour or something like that. And now the rescue squad manages that quarry, but they use it for training. And you can go out there and see videos that divers have taken in the quarry, and you can see those rail tracks and corroded junk that's still down there. But this time they have oxygen tanks on their back, and they're able to breathe that way. Thank you. Thanks.